Too many inmates and not enough space. Oklahoma prisons are at capacity, and the Department of Corrections says it may have to start refusing to take inmates who are jammed into county jails unless it gets extra money from the state. This week, DOC Director Justin Jones asked legislators for $6.3 million in supplemental funding to get the department through the rest of the fiscal year. Jones says he needs nearly $3.8 million to pay for about 900 new prisoners who entered the system in the last year, and $2 million more to restore cuts to private prison reimbursement rates at a time when county jails are running out of beds.
The Tulsa County Jail currently houses 1,847 inmates. That's 133 more people than they have beds.
Today we have 101 that are what we call Lexington ready. Lexington is the reception center for all Department of Correction inmates. Those people have cleared all their charges, they have nothing open, and they're waiting to be transferred to the Department of Corrections.
Major Shannon Clark of the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office says a week and a half ago they had well in excess of 200 state inmates waiting for transfer to prison. Because of overcrowding, inmates are sleeping in portable beds called boats in common areas of lockup. Boats are also used in other packed jails across the state. The Oklahoma County Jail uses 300 of the portable beds for inmates. 339 of the more than 2,400 inmates there are awaiting state transfer. The Washington County Jail in Bartlesville has been at near capacity for many months. Of the 194 inmates housed there, 40 are waiting transfer to state prison. 16 of them fill up this jail pod, and they may be here a while.
Currently, I have inmates that were sentenced in October that are still here, waiting to be transported. It could be 3 to 4 months, it could be even longer than that. We're essentially at the mercy of DOC.
Overall, there are 1,700 state inmates held at county jails across Oklahoma. That's because the Department of Corrections is at 99% capacity. More than 26,250 inmates are in state prisons. That's nearly more than 900 at this time last year.
Oklahoma's relied on the state prison system to deal with criminal behavior. There are not as many diversion programs at the local level as some other states have or some other counties have.
DOC spokesman Jerry Massey says like other state agencies, DOC had its budget slashed a few years ago. It lost $78 million, and Massey says DOC hasn't returned to its previous funding level. Department of Corrections Director Justin Jones is asking for a nearly $67 million boost in funding in next year's budget. Some of that will pay for the Justice Reinvestment Act passed by lawmakers last year. It calls for sweeping criminal justice reform. One of the main components provides for 9 months of supervision after an inmate completes his or her felony sentence.
Eventually, we need to hire about 45 additional probation and parole officers and some supervisory staff for that, for the mandatory supervision that's going to be required at the end of November.
$12 million of the additional funds would be used for pay increases for prison guards who now make around $11 an hour. Massey says the oil boom in Oklahoma is taking employees and prospective hires away from DOC. That's because workers can make $4 to $5 more an hour to work in the oil field.
What we're seeing is staff leaving us. We're currently, for correctional officers, we're at about 63% of what we ought to be.
But the Department of Corrections' immediate concern is to have enough money to operate for the rest of this fiscal year. DOC is requesting $6.3 million to, in part, pay for the 900 extra prisoners added to the system since last year. If lawmakers don't come up with the supplemental funding, DOC Director Jones says he will quit taking state prisoners who are stacked up in county jails, jails that are already being financially squeezed. The state reimburses counties $30 a day for each inmate. Well, are you losing money?
Oh, absolutely. Every county, I think, is losing money to some degree. $30 is very minimal. When you start talking about closing costs and food costs and hygiene and water and electric and medical costs, and medical is just skyrocketing.
Major Clark says some smaller jails that don't have the kind of overhead that Tulsa does can make money on $30 per inmate a day. So when the Tulsa jail is full, Clark asked those smaller lockups to take state prisoners. So it's a constant juggling act, I guess.
Constant. I think we have a harder time than most accountants as far as juggling numbers.
Major Clark notified DOC of their high inmate population a week and a half ago, and DOC responded by recently picking up 100 state inmates. Clark says they have a good working relationship with DOC, but if the need arises, the jail has another option.
So when we call Department of Corrections and say we have to invoke means that we say that we are at capacity and you have to take these inmates. The DOC is then obligated that they have to pull the majority of their inmates.
At the Washington County Jail, they might feel the need to invoke, but can't.
Although we are at 194 and our bed space is 220, half of a housing unit may be only female, so that limits me on who can be placed into that bed space, which greatly hinders us being able to notify the DOC and say we are at capacity, although truly we are unless we receive 15 female inmates in all of a sudden at once.
And no relief is in sight at the county or state level. This week, the State Pardon and Parole Board is reviewing almost 700 parole cases.
Will you please state your name and DOC number for the record?
This is the first time the board is working under a new law established after voters passed State Question 762 in November. It amended Oklahoma's constitution to remove the governor from the parole process for nonviolent offenders.
60 years we've had parole in Oklahoma. Never had a parole certificate ever signed by anybody but the governor. Only state in the union that was like that.
Pardon and Parole Board Chairperson Dr. Mark Dreyer says their new rule doesn't mean more paroles will be granted.
We're being very conservative, and I think we're only granting paroles to those that are similar to the ones we would have granted when the governor was behind us in the process, and maybe even a little more conservative than that, because we don't want our first month to be peppered with mistakes.
He does say their new authority will speed up the release of prisoners who are paroled, thereby saving DOC money.
If 50 even offenders got out 30 days earlier than they would have if they had to process through the governor, you've saved that amount times $65 to $70 a day.
And what happened in cases like that of Corey Nelson won't be repeated. Nelson appeared for a review before the parole board this week. The board granted Nelson a parole 2 years ago, but the governor denied it due to a misconduct report that later turned out to be erroneous. Nelson's attorney says there was also confusion about whether his client had completed some programs while incarcerated.
So it was completely a product of a technicality with one hand not knowing what the other was doing between the parole board and the governor's office.
Nelson had to remain in prison until his case came up for another parole review.
Some offenders every year have an annual review, some are every 3 years. And so that can happen, and it's an unfortunate thing, and it did happen to him.
Nelson has now served 7.5 years of a 10-year sentence for trafficking a controlled dangerous substance. This week, board members learned Nelson has put his time to good use.
You took some college classes, you did your Thinking for a Change, that's your cognitive behavior program, you did life skills, you've had the craft program and a computer VOTEC, so you've been very, very active.
At the end of his hearing, Nelson's family and supporters heard the words they had been waiting for.
Parole is granted.